Yep.
Hey, so a big welcome to everyone. I am Becky Diamond, the president of the Historic Foodways Society of the Delaware Valley. We call ourselves HFSDV for short, and we have been celebrating and learning about food history for over 25 years. And we are dedicated to the promotion and understanding of food history. We strive to taste the past through food tastings, foodway experts, and visits to historic sites. And we welcome you to join us. Our dues are just $25 per calendar year. That's for anyone who has not joined as a member. I'm going to put that in the chat here if anyone's interested. And the membership does include a robust schedule of programming. Dan has outlined the whole year. It's, a program a month and a range of price points, both virtual and in person in areas throughout the Delaware Valley. So I'm going to put that link in too if anyone's just interested in looking at, what's coming up a little bit. Oops, the other one. There's the membership. There's the upcoming programs. And then we just have been asking, because we do 3 virtual programs a year, usually in the winter time. And we are asking if we do have a link for donations, if anyone's would like to make a donation for that, since this is a free program. And then I just wanted to let you know about our next program, which is April 21st at noon, and it's going to be called Pennsylvania Barns, what they can tell us about what we ate. And Jeff Marshall will be presenting. He is the author and historic barn expert from, it's going to be located in Durham Hill Farms in Pipersville, PA. And next, I just want to give a really warm welcome to our presenter today, David Shields. He is a professor at the University of South Carolina, and he is known as the flavor saver. He tracks down lost food crops and assists in restoring them to fields and tables. Carolina gold rice, Fox prolific corn, rice peas, purple straw wheat, the dye house cherry, Benny, Carolina African runner peanut, purple ribbon sugar cane, Hicks mulberry, seashore black seed rye, Bradford watermelon. So these are all some of the crops. And he has written award-winning agricultural and culinary histories. The first is Southern Provisions, The Culinarians, Taste the State, and now the Ark of Taste, which I can't recommend enough. I just have been loving this book so much. I just devoured it. And his research links horticultural to the table, agricultural to home, and professional cookery. He chairs the Carolina Gold Rice Foundation, heads the Ark of Taste Committee for the South, and holds the Carolina Distinguished Professorship at the University of South Carolina. He is the Southern Foodways Alliance's Keeper of the Flame, a James Beard finalist in food history, and Slow Food's trailblazer for biodiversity. He won the Brown Award for the best single book about American Popular in 2013. And he and longtime collaborator Kevin Mitchell will be hosting and writing a PBS television show, The Flavor Savers, in 2024 and 2025. So I am so pleased to welcome you today, David. I do ask everyone to save your questions to the end. You can put them at the chat in the chat as he's talking, and I'll monitor that. And then also to please mute yourselves once David starts talking, so that we can really give our full attention to what he's saying. So David, please take it away. We're thrilled to have you here.
Thank you so much for inviting me. And Delaware Valley is a place close to my heart. My wife's family comes from the southwest of New Jersey. Hamilton blueberries were much consumed in my household, and my portions of my family come from the Paxtons, who are infamous in Pennsylvania history as the Paxton Boys in the 18th century, who were up to no good. So I'm here today to talk about the Ark of Taste, which is Slow Food's global register of the most historically resonant, flavorful, and imperiled foods on the planet. It was a listing that was initiated by Carlo Petrini in Italy in 1996. And it served a really interesting purpose. There was no Hall of Fame or international register which indicated which were the best sorts of plants for human consumption, ones that were local signature plants of cuisines, until Slow Food initiated this. So it was very difficult to have a central clearinghouse or repository of information about heritage plants of nations. And since 1996, this has existed. The Ark of Taste is not a seed vault or a museum. Instead, it operates as a kind of repository of information, supplying accurate descriptions, information on food sources, and also explanations of why certain foods have become endangered. It's a mechanism for focusing attention and raising consciousness. To that end, Slow Food USA published last year in August a selection of some of the most significant of the entries on the American Ark of Taste. Now, there's over 6,000 global entries on the global Ark of Taste, and the United States only has about 350 foods entered into its Ark. And perhaps one of the reasons is that foods enter into the Ark by citizen nomination. People have to believe that a certain ingredient in their locale is particularly noteworthy, is tasty, and write up a nomination and submit it. And it has to be vetted by experts in horticulture. We usually have a culinary expert to determine whether or not, indeed, it is a tasty item. And we'll talk a little about that later. The Ark of Taste is illustrated by wonderful line engravings, and it was co-written by Giselle Kennedy Lord, who did significant numbers of producer profiles. So you get the personalities who are the guardians.
People still joining.
Certain of the plants. The book is organized by region. We have a New England Northeast region. We have the Southwest. We have the Midwest, Pacific Northwest, Rocky Mountain, and Southwest. And items from these regions are included. One of the things that has happened since the quarter of a century that the Ark has been in existence, and is that they think that the Ark of Taste is just a sort of register for particularly popular heirloom plants. And one of the problems was in the first years of the existence of the Ark of Taste, people ignored the criteria of endangered or imperiled status and just nominated regional foods like the Gulf Coast shrimp or the staghorn sumac or the Louisiana mirliton. But since around 2008, 2009, we've been serious that only those plants which are imperiled are the ones that deserve this special attention and active intervention in their behalf. A case in point is Hickory King corn. This is an heirloom corn that was introduced in 1880 by A.O. Lee in Hickory Junction, Virginia. It was a pencil cob, large, deep kerneled white dent corn whose kernels were so large that they became the sort of things that were used in salted corn kernels and snacks. In recent years, it's become a popular pozole or hominy corn among Latinos in the South. But Hickory King, since it will grow on a sand dune, is the most tolerant of variable soil conditions of any heirloom dent corn, is now grown globally. It is the most widely grown heirloom corn in the world. In no way is it endangered. So even though that it's a significant, tasty heirloom corn, it is not something on the Ark of Taste. One purpose of the Ark of Taste is to ignite a more general demand for it. And to do this, we tell the story of the food, and we've done this in this Ark of Taste book. We also put it in the hands of chefs. We supply information about how historically these foods were prepared. If the food was brought associated with a particular Native American group or an ethnic group, how that particular tradition prepared it is something that we're very concerned with. The collaboration between the Ark of Taste and professional chefs is documented in the Ark of Taste book by having certain recipes in there presented by chefs who specialize in local heirloom foods. Sometimes an endangered plant that was embraced by the Ark of Taste and put into the hands of chef develops an enormous following. The Cherokee purple tomato is perhaps the poster child of this development. It has become so popular that it is in no way endangered now. We see this as the Ark of Taste performing its intended duty, saving an endangered rare heirloom plant by drawing attention to it. I was particularly concerned with the revival of the United States' most classic rice, Carolina gold rice, which in the 18th century became the dominant rice export of the United States. And it went out of production in the First World War as cheap Honduran white rice supplanted it. At the end of the 20th century, people reading accounts of the taste of Carolina gold rice, chefs began to call for its supply once again. And a group of people who I was associated with began growing it again. And at the end of the first decade of the 21st century, it became a universal pantry staple among American chefs. It was America's rice. If you're cooking American food, Carolina gold is what you cook. And there was an Ark of Taste ingredient again that was revived and then popularized and has now gone out of endangered status. I want to say something about why heirlooms are important. One of the things that probably doesn't surprise you is for much of the latter half of the 20th century, geneticists and plant breeders did not test their various productions for flavor. Instead, they were interested in agronomic performance, whether it was disease resistant, how processable or transportable a vegetable was. And as a result, flavor became increasingly marginalized organized in the production of vegetables and grains in particular. Now, prior to the rise of modern scientific plant breeding, farmers who saved their own seed would always test their grain for flavor. And the category or the qualities that they sought when they tasted the corn were not exactly the sort of qualities that we think of when we think of taste. We think of, salty, umami, sweet, sour, those categories of taste sensation. But there's another language which is older and maybe more profound about flavor that concerns wholesomeness. And grains were consumed usually in the form of a whole grain porridge. And it was the flavor of that which would determine a grain farmer, whether or not his grain was supplying him that energy charge, that sumptuousness that he thought was necessary for the strength of his family and himself. Now, as a result of thousands of plant generations of selecting for flavor and for field performance, you had the creation of very ancient strains or forms of various grains, and these are called the land races. And all of these land races differ from modern grain cultivars in that they have much more elaborate root systems that were intended for growth in living soil. In modern industrial cultivation, the cultivars are created to maximally uptake the particular chemical packages that are injected into the soil, and the soil itself has been fumigated with the living entities in it killed off. Now, what's misguided about this idea is that it's the bacteria, the microbes in the soil that break down minerals into organic chemicals. And it's the mycorrhizomes, the fungal filaments that permeate the soil that communicate those chemicals to the plant. And if you have an heirloom plant with an elaborate root system, one of the things that it does is that it injects tremendous amounts of sugar into the soil to cultivate or to create a zone around the root system to encourage the growth of these this fungal world, which connects the roots to nutriment as many as 50 feet away from the stalk of the plant. Heirloom plants uptake micronutriments in larger quantities from vaster distances than modern cultivars. That is why they are tastier. And there have been a lot of experiments done about how root systems respond to certain chemical conditions in the soil. The genetic diversity of landrace plants is more various and adaptable than the very closely focused, genetically bottlenecked modern cultivars. So I hope you didn't mind that sort of digression on why heirlooms are tastier and what tastier means in terms of the function of these old plants. They just have more power to extract nutrition from the soil and deliver it to you. So one of the things that we deal with in North America is that many of the land races, the ancient forms of vegetables and grains that exist, were developed by various indigenous peoples in North America and in Central America. And I was thinking about the Delaware Valley in particular, and how the Lenape and the Delaware and the Unami and other of the native peoples of the region developed a exquisitely locally adapted panoply of vegetables and grains suited to the region. I don't know how many of you have ever tasted a Nanticoke squash, Cucurbita maxima. And this is a squash that was introduced relatively late in history into North America, in the 1500s, about the time of the Spanish settlement of Central and South America. These squash come into the middle Atlantic states and were grown all throughout Delaware, and now in as far as southern New York. They're beautiful Cucurbita maximas, and if you want a wonderful baked squash of the winter squash variety, squash pie, a candied squash, this is one worth considering. It is not on the Ark of Taste. Now, taking a look at this picture, you can see how the genetic diversity of these ancient squashes manifests itself in a kind of plastic difference of forms. And one of the things you have to say about these ancient plants is that they are very sensitive to local chemical soil conditions. Along with its genetics, its legacy that's been passed down from its parents, it also has what are called epigenetics, a series of chemical switches that are either off or on that will cause a plant to develop a certain trait if certain things are found in its vicinity. So if you grow a kind of Nanticoke squash that was first grown in New Jersey and planted in the upper Delaware Valley, up in southern New York, for instance, the soil conditions, day length, may cause it to change color, to change form, make it more warty, make it less warty. This is the natural adaptation mechanisms of the squash to perform optimally under the widest variety of conditions. Now, when we're worrying about how shifts in climate conditions are disrupting food crops in the United States, one thing you have to say about these old heirloom plants is that they have an inbuilt flexibility to adapt themselves. You don't have to engage in the rebreeding of a plant variety to suit higher temperatures. This plant will shift the way it forms its fruit to operate in response to the conditions it finds itself in. One of the things that is wonderful about the Delaware Valley is that it has a person who was a historian of plant varieties and a great seed saver. And I'm talking about William Moyes Weaver of Roughwood Seed in Pennsylvania. And the Roughwood collection takes a lot of the material that was grown in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, Delaware, Maryland. And also, he's very interested in European introductions into America, the best peas, the best beans, the best garden vegetables. So the Roughwood collection has numbers of these. And here are three items that aren't currently on the Ark of Taste that should be. Someone should write a nomination for these plants. And these are the Lenape purple King Sessing pole bean. Pole beans are ones that have a vining habit, and you train them along a bamboo pole or some sort of support. The Delaware blue sweet corn. Take a look at that. We usually think of sweet corn being light colored, but there is a deep purple blue corn variety that makes wonderful corn pudding, if that's one of your favorite things. And then the Yanami yellow custard squash, which is, you can see that that's a summer squash configuration with deep yellow hue. If you want to make a squash casserole with a sumptuous tasting squash, that's one you should pick up seeds for. All three in the Roughwood seed collection, and all three deserving of a place on the Ark of Taste. Now, one of the things you have to say about farming and horticulture in general in the United States in the 19th century was that you had a lot of farmers collecting a lot of varieties of things, and in a kind of haphazard experimental way, growing them all at the same time in the same countryside. And these are open pollinated, sexually propagated plants. And when you have that much promiscuous pollen floating around in the air, you get numbers of seedlings which are very difficult to track down the parentage of, and which might turn into splendid things. There was a profusion of the new, particularly in the world of fruit in the 19th century. One of the things that I was thinking about was, what of all of the great number of apples that came from your region is the one which is most magnificent, the most tasty? Down south, I think about, the various cider apples that we have here, like the Hughes crab apple and the Yates cider apple and the Arkansas black. You have the Harrison apple that exists in New Jersey. Nice mealy sort of cider apple, but you have this wonderful
Mom, I'm trying to.
Jersey black apple, which was first identified in 1817. It's white-fleshed, fresh eating, was used for dessert, but it was also used as a cider apple. It's one of the parents of the very popular Macoun apple, splendid in its own right. The interesting thing, though, is if you are looking to get scionwood to propagate this apple, it isn't being grown in the Delaware Valley now, to my knowledge. It's being grown extensively in Canada and British Columbia, and it's being grown in England, where there is an appreciation for old apples. So if you want a project, if you want to bring something back, maybe bringing back the Jersey black apple would be a great sort of enterprise to undertake to better the fruits of your region. One of the things which is a problem about fruit is that the markets are organized increasingly toward monopolies. Everyone knows that when you walk into a grocery store, you don't see the variety of bananas you see in any market in the West Indies. You see one banana and maybe one plantain. And that banana is the Cavendish banana. If you're looking for dates, there are two dates that you will find. the medjool and the deglet nor, or what we used to call the dromedary date around holiday season. There are 3 avocado varieties that you will find in a grocery store: the Haas, the Forte, and the Pinkerton. But over the course of American history, there have been multitudes of bananas that were grown in the tropical regions, Florida, Hawaii, Southern California. In Southern California, a date culture erupted in the early 20th century that produced at least 2 dozen splendid dates. For instance, the one in this illustration, the Abado. And they're grown locally in California, but you have to go on the internet and go to the Oasis Date Company, or my family's company, the Shields Date Farms, and order them because you won't be able to get them in the grocery store. One of the purposes of the Ark of Taste is to inform you of the bananas like the Ella Ella that are beyond the Cavendish, or the dates, or the avocados like the Wilson Pope No, an avocado the size of a football that has a kind of minty taste and a creamy texture. The restaurateur Linton Hopkins, a number of years ago, during the height of the avocado toast craze, said to me, if we could get an avocado that has all of the creaminess of the avocado, but a different taste, that would be pure money for us. So there are people now in Florida growing the Wilson Pope No. You will never find it in your local store because it will all be bought up by restaurateurs. There are other sorts of problems that make us consider boarding something on the Ark of Taste. There's a crisis now in Florida in the citrus industry because of a disease called greening. And all of the old varieties of citrus, with the exception of certain limes, are very vulnerable to it. The classic grapefruits, like the Duncan grapefruit depicted here. This was the white grapefruit that was the model for all white grapefruits. The original taste of grapefruit juice was the Duncan. Now there may be 2 healthy groves in all of the state of Florida. The original tangerine, the Dancy, the Christmas tangerine with the zipper skin that was so easy to open. The first tangerine variety in America, now surviving in only yard plants and on the West Coast. Nowadays, what happens is that all of the energy is put into doing disease-resistant citrus. And those old citrus varieties that form the standards of flavors are being surrendered as victims to history. The money and energy to protect them is not worth the effort in the eyes of the powers that be, and they're going to be swept away. I want to talk about wild foods too. There are limits to Slow Food's mantra of eat it to save it. There are certain endangered fish, fowl, and amphibians which have been hunted to the point where their future is in question. And in recognition of this, the Ark only boards a wild food if works have been done by institutions and persons to ensure its future population. Hence, the Atlantic sturgeon, which exists only in limited numbers in the wild but exists in farm circumstances in larger numbers. And the American paddlefish, which operates in the Mississippi River Basin, which is intensively farmed and every year with annual fry releases numbering in the millions, is the population buoyed in the face of environmental degradation and angling. For the Delaware Valley, the diamondback terrapin, which is native to the waters of the Delaware and its tributaries, is a case in point. It was so popular. Terrapin a la Maryland or terrapin stew with Madeira was the first dish in every Philadelphia banquet worth its name in the Gilded Age. It was hunted and consumed to the point of near extinction, and it's proven very difficult to farm terrapin. Yet, looking at the Delaware Valley, the Port Mahon project, protecting terrapin habitat in the Delaware River Valley, has been a very promising venture. It is operating on a larger scale than a farm. It is trying to protect an entire sort of section of an estuary where terrapin can go through their entire life cycle protected. Though I've been talking about plants exclusively in this talk, we do, the Ark of Taste does recognize heritage breeds, fowls, hogs, geese, goats. And one of the things that it's become a matter of debate for us is, should we include on the Ark plants which were used to feed livestock to make them particularly tasty? For instance, this mulberry tree here, planted in the 1850s, was intended to feed hogs. It's an everbearing mulberry, and 46 of those trees planted at 40-foot intervals in an acre could support 100 hogs for a third of a year. Now, you usually slaughtered hogs as shotes, that is, when they're relatively young, before they go over 120 pounds maximum. So if you can use mulberries to feed a hog for half its life and have an adjacent peanut field or apple orchard to finish the hogs on, you don't have to engage in the cultivation of grain for hog feed. This is as close to a substitute for wild masting as exists. So should we board these things? Mulberry-fed hog is the most tremendous tasting thing. The only thing better, I think, is chestnut-fed hog. And anyone who's been to Italy and tasted a hamon that is from a chestnut-fed pig, you'll know what I'm talking about. Chestnut-fed chicken, tremendous. So something to think about. Everbearing trees are crosses of the native red mulberry with the Chinese white mulberry that was introduced in the late 18th century for silk manufacture in the United States. Now, most people, when they want to engage personally with the Ark of Taste, think about vegetables. And one of the things you have to say is that there are a number of really important seed companies historically that operate in your region. Peter Henderson in Jersey City may be responsible for more important vegetable introductions into the American pantry than anyone in the 19th century. And numbers of the things which he introduced, the ponderosa tomato, the white velvet okra, the bush lima bean, which has been, all of these things are on the Ark of Taste, transformed American consumption in the 19th century. You're looking at the Jersey Wakefield cabbage, which was one of his introductions, a modification of the English Wakefield cabbage, which in itself was an adaptation of the old German Filderkraut cabbage, the very best cabbage for sauerkraut. And I would put forward the American Wakefield cabbages, both the Jersey and the Charleston Wakefield cabbage, the very best coleslaw cabbage that you can have for cold slaw, not hot slaw. In Philadelphia, the Mall Seed Company, organized by William Henry, was a nationally important seed company. And their butter lettuce, the Philadelphia butter lettuce, enjoyed spectacular success. In the South, we have Bibb limestone lettuce from Kentucky, which is our standard lettuce, which has that soft leaf sumptuousness. And you have the Boston lettuces up in New England, but this is the Middle Colony's version of these very tender, soft leaf lettuces, the finest salad lettuce that you can get. This particular strain was another one that was saved by Wars Weaver. If I were to name a single thing that was created by seedsmen and women of the Delaware Valley in the 19th century in terms of its influence on American table, I would have to say that Stoll's evergreen sweet corn, which dominated American tables for sweet corn from 1857 to 1957. 1957, about the time when the Rogers brothers introduced Silver Queen, white sweet corn. No other sweet corn has had that dominance. And even Silver Queen, its reign lasted in 40 years until the super sweets, like How Sweet It Is. And now the sweet bicolor have supplanted it in terms of the taste. Let me tell you, I'm not a great fan of some of these super sweet corns. There are things that they're wonderful for, like sweet corn ice cream. But if you put it in an old corn pudding recipe, the hyper sweetness, the sort of candyish nature is too much. It's like that sugar shock you get when eating a bowl of Kellogg's sugar frosted flakes, Kellogg sugar frosted flakes. So there's a little history of the corn. So one of the things that's interesting is that sometimes great creations get lost. That's what happened in the South. Back in the beginning of this century, I was asked by Glenn Roberts, the CEO of Anson Mills, perhaps America's foremost miller of heirloom grains. He wanted to bring back Carolina gold rice, but he wanted to bring back all of the other things in the growing system that the Southern rice plantations presented. And he came up to me, he said, "You do research. The problem we have is we've lost so much, we don't even know what we've lost. You do research, could you go and find out?" And so I spent 3 years actually researching old seed catalogs. I read all of the old ag journals, cover to cover, treatises on soil chemistry from the 1840s, things like that. And I came up with a list of 45 ingredients, which were the enduring elements of the food system. Of those, only two, okra and collards, remained in cultivation in the same form it had for over a century. All of the other stuff had been supplanted by modern field performance cultivars in the last part of the 20th century, and they were relatively flavorless. So we had the list, and we spent 15 years looking for things. And one of the things that we discovered was that if a vegetable or a grain or a fruit is truly the best tasting one of a certain category, there's always some old believer somewhere who turned his back on the shiny vegetable and lurid color on the latest February issue of the seed catalog, the newest and fanciest, and kept the old thing growing. And over the past 15 years, we discovered 41 of the 43 that we were looking for. The ones that we didn't get, a strawberry variety, and the original rye whiskey corn, white mammoth rye of the Southern Mountains. Let me tell you, if we find the latter, I have distillers lined up 10 deep who want it. Last known to be grown 1990 in Canada. So what is the most wanted lost vegetable that is banished from your area? Well, it's the Mercer potato, also called the Mischaneg, the Nefanox, the Nishnok, the Chenango, the Philadelphia, the Blue Nose, but most commonly the Mercer. It was discovered by John Gilly in 1811, growing along Neshannock Creek in Newcastle, Pennsylvania. Tubers rather long and flat in shape, with numerous eyes, skin white, tinged with pale purple on the tip end, from which circumstance it has been called by some the blue nose. One cut in two, a circle of the same color as the tip and end is discovered around the center. This is from the Genesee Farmer, 1831. The great selling point of this old potato was its flavor. It was the favorite mashing potato of home cooks for a long, long period of time. It wasn't as productive, disease resistant, or early as other potatoes introduced in the market in the 19th and 20th centuries, but its taste was memorable. So memorable that when it vanished from the region, it was regretted and remembered. So I was thinking about the history of this, and I was looking around, and I found this picture of a potato that has become the signature potato of Nova Scotia. And what is it called? The Blue Nose. you take a look at the cut section there, there seems to be a little purple circle there paralleling the perimeter skin. It may be that this is the Mercer potato, the lost potato of Delaware Valley mashed potatoes. So folks, I'm not saying that some of you should smuggle Nova Scotian potatoes across the border illegally in the trunk of your car during your next visit up there, but it may be up there. And if you're willing to go through the quarantine procedures, it might be worth pursuing. I want to just observe a few things in closing. One is, what sorts of things are not represented in the Ark of Taste that are edible? Well, one of the interesting things is that there are no fungus, no mushrooms on the Ark of Taste. And that isn't to say that there are no fungus that are endangered or rare. There's just been a decision made that there should not be an exploration of these things because perhaps of the perils that might ensue. The identification of certain mushrooms is sometimes very difficult. You actually have to have a paper with the spore pattern coming from the gills to determine what variety it is. So if you're a mushroom hunter with a particular rare variety that you cherish, I don't think that your nomination will be credited much. What more? Well, returning to a theme I touched on in brief earlier, climate change is altering what thrives where. And one of the things that we find is that certain things that were once popular, indeed essential, aren't performing well anymore. There are certain corn varieties that are widely planted now, which, because of the increasingly dry conditions in the Central America, in the Midwest aquifers, they are parching and not producing like they should. So one of the things that we're really concerned about is how can we ensure that vegetables and fruits that were developed maybe in one region can be preserved perhaps by moving them into another or trying them out in an area where the climate zone has shifted. So that's something we're really concerned about. And the other thing is that geneticists have become very interested in the genetic flexibility of these land races. The people who are now breeding the corn cultivars and the sorghum cultivars and the fruit cultivars of the future want to take a look at the oldest forms of these plants. Because if a plant variety has survived for thousands of years, in basically the same similar configuration, it has something going for it, something that the future of the world might depend on. I write books on a lot of subjects. Here is my current bookshelf of things which I've written. You'll see that I write about early American culture. I'm also a historian of photography. That book still is the standard history of silent motion picture photography, which is one of my fascinations. And I have a website if you're interested in Broadway, called Broadway Photographs, which is considered the standard reference on the visual culture of the American stage. Thank you for listening to me for this last little while. I hope that there are things that I said which, if they don't stimulate your mind, at least get your gastric juices percolating.
Thank you so much, David. That was really fabulous. And I mean, I know I learned a great deal, and I'm sure everyone else did too. And we have a few questions here in the chat. I know I was furiously writing some down. I'm like, well, let me see what other people ask, because I don't want to be the only one asking you things. But if I'm going to go back to the beginning, and Dan asked, how do you nominate something for the Ark?
What I would do is go and put Ark of Taste in Google, and that'll take you to either the Italian headquarters or the United States headquarters. And there's a form there that you can fill out online, and it guides you to the sorts of questions that we're interested in. Can it be grown sustainably? Is there a current seed source for this? Is it truly endangered? What sort of history can you verify for a plant? One of the real problems about certain plants is that they exist and people make up stories about them because they don't know the true history. And so fake lore is something that operates as a kind of fog around certain beans in particular. Everyone's finding beans in pots that have been exhumed, that have been in the ground for 1,000 years in a Native American cave somewhere, or beans that were discovered in a turkey craw. And it's interesting that this turkey craw has existed in 6 or 7 states. So.
Right. Well, yeah. So there you go, Dan. If you have any, that's how you go about it.
Thank you.
He also asked, when you were talking about apples, you said that the British have an appreciation for old apples. Why is that? And why, like, don't we have an interest here in the US?
Right. Well, the Romans introduced the apple into Britain, into the British Isles. And since that time, it's been like the central fruit of the islands. There's been no other fruit that has competed with it. In the United States, we have plums, we have peaches, we have citrus, we have dates, and we have great nuts. I mean, the United States is blessed with black walnuts, butternuts, hickory nuts, pecans. We have native hazelnuts. But in England, the apple ruled, and making scrumpy cider, baking with apples became an enormously elaborated subject. Now, it's true that apricots came in later and became a fashionable plant to grow in the English countryside, but never supplanting the popularity and ubiquity of apples. In the United States, it's interesting that cider culture is revived relatively recently. You know, for a long time, Prohibition killed, the classic hard cider culture in the United States. And instead, you had apple juice. And I think it's really interesting that, our taste buds have really been trained to think of apples in terms of juice. So we even breed apples like the Honeycrisps. So they supply a pop of juice when you bite into them. We don't anymore breed apples for drying or sauce apples, which were a variety. We don't we look for all-arounders that you can bake, you can eat desserts, you can crunch for cider. But it used to be specialized, and that was lost in the 20th century.
And then Dan also asked, which this is interesting. Did you ever think about doing a tasting of the Ark, many of the Ark foods?
We've done that on occasion, but again, this is something that should be done regionally because sourcing Ark foods is always the question. There have been times when Slow Food had annual conventions where Ark foods are featured. And there are people like Dan Barber up in New York who make a point of using Ark foods as a kind of central element in their cuisine. Anytime taste is your primary concern, the intrinsic taste of grains or vegetables or plants, because taste is an explicit criteria of the Ark of Taste. It's in the name. There's an interest. Chefs have always been interested in the Ark of Taste.
And it's funny that actually leads in. I went to the end of the questions because Carol Ann Harris has a similar question to what you just said, asking if there's a list of restaurants that might specialize in using these foods. She's read about some indigenous run restaurants, but most are in the Western states, and she doesn't know about any in this area.
Right. It's interesting. I would expect that Western New York would be a center of native cuisine, but Minneapolis, Minnesota seems to be the heart of the native food revival, and the Southwest and West being second. But there are people that are really beginning to work in other regions too. I know that in my state, there's a Mohawk chef, Dave Smoke McCluskey, who engages in the traditional practice of nixtamalizing corn to make hominy, whole hominy and hominy grits. And that's live processing them. And by live processing, you actually have a situation where you can uptake the niacin in the corn. If it isn't processed that way, you don't get the niacin. And if you make corn your staple, you might suffer a vitamin deficiency disease called pellagra. I mean, if you were just eating cornbread and corn on the cob all the time, like certain dirt farmers in the South did, you would get this vitamin deficiency disease if you didn't lye treat your corn. Native American procedure, and they've become very much in the forefront of reviving nixtamalization of corn products.
And now I'm going to ask one of my questions, and that was that when you were talking about the nutrition of some of these heirloom, especially vegetables, so how do they stack up against, like, I know so many of our fruits and vegetables now are so homogenized, but do these varieties have some? And then you mentioned that Delaware blue sweet corn and the yellow custard squash, because they are those brighter colors. Do they have more?
Yeah, carotene certainly is an indicator of something. If you have something that's really orangey or red, you've got, a pretty powerful set of vitamins operating in there. Here's an indication. Oats are something which are grown in the Delaware Valley. There's a type of oat called the winter turf oat. It's basically grown for horse feed because it was a colored oat. And humans tended to prefer white oats for their own table consumption. There's a reason for that. You can tell on a white oat if spoilage has occurred, and if it's if you get ergot fungus growing on your oats, breakfast will be a psychedelic experience. So you don't want that. And you can't tell if that fungus is on your oat with the colored oats. So most colored oats were used for feed. Now, what happens is that horse racing becomes a fixation. And oat breeders are breeding oats that have more and more energy charge to them. They become sort of like horse rocket fuel. And so these winter turf oats are about 24% protein, where modern cultivar oats are around 16%. That's a tremendous amount more of, inherent power in your oat. If you have a bowl of turf oats for breakfast, it's like guzzling a 6-pack of Red Bull to begin your day. You'll be up and ready for anything.
I love that analogy. Oh gosh. Okay. Thank you for that answer. That definitely helps me understand a little bit more. Let's see. Eliza asked, well, she says, thank you so much. I learned so much about many of the fantastic tasting old and rare produce. I visited, and I'm not going to say this right, Eliza, the Arboralo Archeologo in Umbria that specializes in old pears. Maybe we need something like that here.
Right.
So,
There is an ancient pear called the Endicott pear that grows in Massachusetts that was planted like in the 1620s, 1630s. And it's the oldest pear tree in North America. And I was with a group of people maybe 15, 20 years ago, and we were allowed to sample the pears. And one of the people in the group said, "This pear tastes horrible. It's so sharp and bitter." And that was because the pear variety was intended for perry, that is pear cider. It wasn't a dessert pear. Having a product like pear cider that could be kept year round is so much more valuable to a society that is still in its subsistence phase than having a fresh fruit that will perish within a month. So of course they want liquid pears designed for alcoholic beverages as their first pears.
Dan also asked, and I'm curious about this too, because I often say this in my talks about when people ask what you would want to try from, say the 19th century. And I always say, well, things wouldn't have tasted the same at all. And so he asked, is it really impossible to duplicate the taste when we're making old recipes since the food's tastes have been altered over time?
Right. I don't think the taste of that Endicott pear changed much over the centuries. I don't think the strontium levels in the rainwater affected much the juiciness of that pear or anything like that. I do think that that there is a historical change in the way we season food. Perhaps in the type of textures we want. There are kinds of fashions that exist in food that are kind of odd. Becky, that in the 1890s, there was this wild fixation on white food with white cucumbers, white celery, white asparagus, white okra. They're breeding everything white. What's going on there? And and sometimes you can point to things that lead to changes in the way that we consume stuff. Like all of American rice was non-aromatic until the 1960s, when health food markets began importing basmati rice, which is aromatic. And then in the 1980s, jasmine rice becomes a fixture at this wave of Thai restaurants that sweeps over the United States. So by 1990, you had Americans who wanted perfumey rice. This had never existed. This demand had never existed before. And by 2000, um, there was a substantial market for aromatic rices, so much so that American rice breeders began taking their standard non-aromatic varieties and adding odor alleles from either basmati or one of the jasmines, so that they could have a perfume too.
Right. Wow, that's a great description and example. Absolutely. The last question that I see is Alice McBee says, "This is so incredible. Thank you. I'm wondering if you garden, and if so, what you're planning to grow this season."
My wife does the gardens in my family, and flowers are her passion. I get all sorts of rare seeds, and I put them in the hands of people who are professional gardeners, people much more expert than I. And so the things that I'm most interested in seeing, we found what I think is the early English frame pea, extinct pea that was very, very popular in America in the early 19th century. It survived in a portion of the South under the name the old-timey English pea. And it's been grown out at Monticello. And they confirmed that it indeed has the configuration and growth timetable of this early pea. I want to see it grown. I want to eat it. So I'm taking seeds from this stuff that we found and giving it to some local farmers so I can have, hopefully in a relatively few short weeks, a plate of peas.
Oh, very cool. Well, you'll have to let us know what they taste like, and give us some feedback on that. That's really interesting.
Right.
Yeah.
I have a newsletter on Substack called Food Lore and More. I
I
also have
I subscribe. Yeah.
a very sort of food-centric Facebook page where sort of my daily observations and experiences with seeds and food are up. But that's a much more personal thing. And if you're curious, you can send me a friend notice and or just follow to see if it's worthwhile for you.
I think I'm on that too, but Facebook's algorithm is so weird sometimes, like to see what
Right.
shows up. But yeah, I think I remember you posting things. I remember seeing things. So yeah, that's great. And I just can't rave enough about the book. It's just so enlightening about how things were grown. Like I love that story about the bananas in Hawaii and just different, how things can't really move around so much, like if you try to transplant. I love the avocado, so things that, I would love to taste some of these things. So thank you for describing them and letting us know about them. Absolutely.
Great.
Yes, thank you so
Um,
much, David. Really, really appreciate it. Great talk. And we
Well-
all will follow you.
Next time I'm up in the vicinity, perhaps we can meet in person and
That would be awesome.
I
Would
can
love
sit
that.
in on one
Yeah.
of your events and get to talk with you all.
That would be
Absolutely.
fantastic. And
I want to attend one of your classes. I want to sign up for one of your
yeah, exactly.
courses.
And best of luck with the television show as well.
Okay,
Thank you,
Hey,
guys.
Absolutely.
good being with you.
We'll see you guys
Thanks
next
so
month. Thank
much.
you.
Take care.